Now, I'll be getting away from the Chocobo games for a little bit, but I wanted to point something out. Chocobo, a game of dice, may have only come out in Japan, and it may have been a remake of a minigame found in a re-release of a racing game, but it's significant for one reason. It's on the Game Boy Advance. The game was the first to come out of a renewed relationship between Square and Nintendo, which continues to this day. And although none of the numbered series have come out on Nintendo consoles yet, sequels and spin-offs have, and there are a lot more of those. The first Square game on a Nintendo console since Final Fantasy VI may have been an obscure dice game with birds, but the next one was a major release, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles on GameCube. Crystal Chronicles is an action RPG similar to The Legend of Zelda, with a strong emphasis on cooperative multiplayer gameplay, and it would become popular enough to gain several sequels. But speaking of sequels and Nintendo systems, next up is a long-awaited sequel, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance for, well, you guessed it, the Game Boy Advance. Though it didn't continue the story of Tactics, it did take place in the same world and has the same basic gameplay, though with upgrades. Next, Squaresoft released another collection of Chocobo minigames, Chocobo D-Mobile, which, as you could probably guess, was on Japanese mobile phones. The Chocobos next got another full game, this time a fully fledged RPG, Final Fantasy Fables Chocobo Tales for the DS, a hybrid of the RPG, adventure, and card battling genres, with several minigames thrown in, of course. This one actually got released in America. Speaking of the DS, next up is Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Ring of Fates for the DS. The gameplay is pretty much the same as the first game, only now players could use the DS's Wi-Fi features for multiplayer. Story-wise, it is a prequel to the original game. Next came two more Tactics games. First was another sequel, Final Fantasy Tactics A2 Grimoire of the Rift, perhaps the largest, most expansive tactics game yet, for the DS. Around the same time came a remake of the original game, Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions for PlayStation Portable. The game featured a retranslated dialogue, new cutscenes, a few extra characters, including the main character from Grimoire of the Rift, and enhancements to gameplay. Next up is another Chocobo dungeon game, Final Fantasy Fables Chocobo's Dungeon. This one I don't have much information on, except it was released on the Wii, and then later on the DS. Speaking of the Wii, Square decided to utilize the WiiWare downloadable game service with a high-profile game. They created a city building simulation, which later in development became a Final Fantasy title, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles My Life as a King. The game featured expansions by way of downloadable content, as well as its own spin-off, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles My Life as a King Everyone's Kingdom, an internet game that could be played in a browser. As with many popular series that have a wide variety of characters, many gamers have often fantasized about a fighting game, where they could square off their favorite characters. With some series, this actually happens. Look at Castlevania, Mega Man, and of course, the Super Smash Bros. Series, which encompasses most of Nintendo's franchises. There actually have been two attempts at a Final Fantasy fighting game. The first one, I'll talk about that more in the next part of the feature, and I'll explain why then. But the one I'm talking about now is Dissidia Final Fantasy for the PlayStation Portable. The game features multiple characters, 2 from each numbered Final Fantasy game up to 10, a hero and a villain from each. There are also unlockable characters to represent 11 and 12. It's a strange game, not really a traditional fighting game. Square calls it dramatic progressive action, which is a description as good as any. And while it's not exactly the type of game you'd expect, fans were just happy to have Sephiroth murder Titus over and over again. So okay, true story time. A while back, I got really addicted to Flash-based tower defense games. Flash Element TD, Bloons TD, Mini TD, StarCraft 2 TD, all great. I immediately thought of how tower defense games could be adapted to several series, one of which was Final Fantasy. Think about it. Instead of towers, you have units using the job system, and instead of manually upgrading them, maybe they'll level up through experience. Boom! Final Fantasy TD. Now, I guess Square was reading my mind from their Orbital Fortress because they released Crystal Guardians, a tower defense game based on Final Fantasy Tactics. Though it was released for Japanese cell phones, it was rebranded as Crystal Defenders and released for WiiWare, Xbox Live Arcade, and the PlayStation Network. Next up, Chocobo Tales gets a sequel, Chocobo and the Magic Picture Book, The Witch, the Girl, and the Five Heroes on the DS, with gameplay pretty much like the first one. Next up, yet another Crystal Chronicles game, this one going multi-platform. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Echoes of Time was released for both the Wii and the DS, and features the same action RPG gameplay with online Wi-Fi multiplayer. As if one Final Fantasy TD game wasn't awesome enough, another one was released, this time based on the Crystal Chronicles series rather than Tactics. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles My Life as a Dark Lord for WiiWare. Oddly, it serves as a sequel to My Life as a King, despite the drastically different gameplay. The Crystal Chronicles series would then continue with another multiplayer action RPG, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles The Crystal Bearers, this time being released only for the Wii. Yet another tower defense game is next, this time a sequel to Crystal Defenders, known as Crystal Defenders Vanguard Storm. Unfortunately, this one has so far remained exclusive to Japanese iPhones. The most recent spin-off is one of the most interesting, though so far it has remained in Japan only. The Four Warriors of Light Final Fantasy Gaiden for the DS is sort of a reimagining of old-school Final Fantasy games, basically taking the gameplay of the older games, particularly 3 with its job system and turn-based battles, and giving them a modern presentation. The game has received excellent reviews and has recently been announced for localization. The last game to talk about hasn't been released yet, and may turn out not to be a true spin-off. The game is so far only referred to as Fortress, and is an action title coming out for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Windows. The game takes place in Ivalice, the same world as the Tactics series, Final Fantasy XII, the Crystal Defenders games, and the PlayStation RPG Vagrant Story. It is unknown how connected to Final Fantasy it will be, and not much information is available on the game just yet. Well, wow, eh? That covers spin-offs. I told you there was a lot. Now, before you post any, "oh, but you forgot this game" comments, wait until the feature is completely over, okay? Join me next time, and we'll talk about Final Fantasy characters appearing in other games, and non-Final Fantasy games that got rebranded as Final Fantasy.